Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So this video is a quick preview and prediction for Errol Spence Jr. versus Yordenis Ugas. Of course this fight goes down today, so I am very late with this prediction. Time has been a bitch as of late. So apologies for the delay on this video, but yeah, it's a fight I'm really looking forward to. Welterweight unification fight, which is always good. We always want to see unification fights. Stylistically, I believe both guys should gel to make a pretty interesting fight. And, you know, there's a few things surrounding this fight that make it intriguing, mainly on the side of Errol Spence. He's been very inactive, as we know. He had that retina injury a couple of years ago. He had that car crash. Could we see a scenario in which that all comes back to bite Errol Spence? Who knows? Who knows? But it certainly makes the fight more interesting. And it's funny because I've actually seen a lot of people give Yordenis Ugas a big chance in this fight. And in fact, I've seen some people pick Ugas to beat Spence. And their reasoning is due to the external circumstances surrounding Spence. So what that tells me is, if both of these guys, if we knew beforehand, both guys were at 100%, I think most people would pick Spence in this fight. It's just down to the outside the ring factors, why people are doubtful of him going into this fight, in my opinion. But nevertheless, it is a really good fight, no matter what the Terence Crawford fanboy dorks say. I'm not going to support this fight because it's not the fight I want. Listen, it's still a good fight. It is what it is. If you don't want to see it, don't watch it. That simple. Let's briefly break down the tale of the tape, and we shall start with Errol Spence Jr., the favourite. He has a record of 27-0, 21 of his 27 wins coming by way of knockout. Yordenis Ugas has a record of 27 wins, 4 defeats, 12 of his 27 wins coming by way of knockout. Errol Spence Jr. is listed as 5'9.5" with a 72-inch reach, whereas Yordenis Ugas is listed as 5'9" with a 69-inch reach. So Errol Spence Jr. is the slightly bigger welterweight. He's half an inch taller and he has a 3-inch reach advantage. Errol Spence Jr. is 32 years old, whereas Yordenis Ugas is 35 years old, but beware, those could be Cuban years, so he might be a bit older. Errol Spence, of course, is a southpaw, and Yordenis Ugas is an orthodox fighter. Now let's briefly break down what I believe both guys should do to stand the best chance of winning this fight, and I guess I'll start with Yordenis Ugas, who in my mind is the underdog in this fight. I think for Yordenis Ugas, he needs to utilise his solid technique and technical ability, his technical skills. Yordenis Ugas is a guy who does the basics very well. He's got a nice jab, decent range control, a decent variety in his work. He can throw the straights, he can go to the body, etc. Nice tight guard. Ugas is one of those guys who does the basics extremely well. He's not the quickest, he's not the most powerful, but he doesn't have any, like, super glaring flaws in his game, if that makes sense. And yeah, for me, Ugas in this fight, I think he needs to start out this fight behind that high guard, nice and tucked, try to keep the elbows nice and tucked to avoid those body shots of Errol Spence Jr. And I think Ugas needs to be boxing behind that jab early on, testing the range against Errol Spence Jr., see how he reacts, etc. And try to draw Errol Spence into a bit of a boxing match, I would say. If I was Ugas, I would try to avoid engaging Errol in a fight, especially early on. I think he needs to start this fight quite circumspect with a consistent jab, a nice high guard, to see what Errol Spence has, and to see how he's reacting to what Ugas is doing. And alternatively, you know, Ugas is the orthodox fighter in this fight, and when he straightens his punches, he does have a really good straight right hand. And, you know, Errol Spence in his career has been susceptible to that shot, as we saw in the Kell Brook fight. Kell Brook did a very good job of utilising that jab, but then feinting with a jab and leading with his right hand. And Errol Spence Jr. was getting caught by that shot quite regularly in that bout. I think maybe Yordenis Ugas should look at that in this fight. I think it's paramount for Yordenis Ugas to get that right hand off early, because think about it, Errol Spence is the guy who's got a lot of question marks surrounding his standing in boxing, and that straight right hand is going to be lined up with Errol Spence Jr.'s left eye, which is the eye he damaged. So I'd be looking to get that right hand off early in this fight. Again, don't take stupid risks. Try to do it from distance. Don't jump in, don't lunge in and take unnecessary risks, but primarily box off that jab and look for the right hand, whether it's behind the jab itself or whether you feint the jab and then try to catch Errol Spence by surprise. Try to test that eye and try to nail Errol Spence early with something decent, with something quite big, to try and get Errol's respect, because Errol is one of those guys where if you don't get his respect, he's going to keep on coming and he's going to grind you down. And Errol Spence Jr., one thing I don't think he gets enough credit for is his toughness. It's going to take a lot to discourage Errol Spence Jr. So although again I'm saying Ugas needs to box he needs to box behind that jab, pay attention to defense, not take too many risks, but at the same time I think he needs to be relatively assertive in this fight. Ugas boxing on the back foot for 12 rounds, could he give Spence problems? Yeah, maybe, but I'm not sure that Ugas has the foot speed to stay away from Spence. Ugas's feet aren't exactly the quickest. He can box on the back foot, but he can be got to. Look at his fight with Abel Ramos, for example, in the last few rounds. Ramos was getting to Ugas, and he hurt Ugas. He couldn't keep Ramos off him for 12 rounds. He won the fight, but he had trouble. So I think Ugas needs to mix caution with assertiveness in this bout. I would say approach it similar to the Sean Porter fight, where he was boxing off that jab, but trying to not give up ground and sometimes apply pressure himself. I thought he'd done very well in that Sean Porter fight. In fact, I felt he won that fight. I'd be trying to take a similar approach in this fight. Don't give Errol Spence too much respect, because again, he's been out for so long now. I would try and test him, and yeah. Providing he navigates the early rounds, Ugas, as it goes into the second half of a fight, at this stage, again, providing on where Errol is and how he's, and what he's showing, then maybe start to, I wouldn't say trade with Errol Spence, but, stay in the pocket a little bit longer to try and get your own body shots off. One thing Ugas does quite well and is quite underrated in is his body work. He does have a nice left hook to the body, for example. Uppercuts to the body as well, and even like jabs to the body and straights to the body. His body work is underrated, and I think he needs to look at this in this fight. And again, I go back to the jab in the early rounds. Try to jab the solar plexus of Errol Spence Jr. When you jab a guy to the solar plexus on a consistent basis, it's a good way to make them reset their approach, but also it can drain the stamina of your opponent. So not only do I want to see Ugas utilise that jab to the head, but also mix it up, go from body to head, mix it up with feints, and try to confuse Errol Spence, and by virtue of that, try to draw the lead of Errol Spence Jr. Ugas is he's a sneaky counterpuncher, Yordenis Ugas. He can catch you by surprise. And again, Errol Spence is a guy who has been countered in quite a few fights at this point. So, yeah, I mean, Ugas he can't afford to run around and try to steal a decision. That is not going to work against Errol Spence, first and foremost. I don't believe he's got the foot speed to do so. I don't believe he's got the gas tank to do that for 12 rounds. And, elephant in the room, it's in Texas, where Errol Spence is from. So I can't see Ugas winning the fight that way. He needs to mix it up. He needs to be assertive at points. Hard jab, counters, straight right hand. Try to get to the body occasionally. And try to match Errol Spence in certain exchanges. He can't afford to pussyfoot around in this fight. As for Errol Spence Jr., well, in my opinion, we know what he brings to the table. He's a very good, aggressive fighter, excellent at mid-range, world-class body puncher, pretty good on the inside as well, and he applies decent pressure, in my opinion. And he needs to bring that pressure to Yordenis Ugas. Again, I've seen in certain fights in the past where Ugas has looked a bit suspect going down the stretch. Again, I go back to that Abel Ramos fight. even before then, when he fought Thomas Delorme back in the day, he started that fight really strongly and really tailed off. So it's up to Errol Spence Jr. in this fight to make it rough and make it physically taxing on Yordenis Ugas. Luckily for Spence, he has the style to do so. So he needs to be the guy applying pressure in this fight. One thing about Errol Spence Jr. I really like is his lead hand control. I think his lead hand control is extremely underrated, and I felt we saw that in the Kell Brook fight. People were acting like Kell Brook was schooling Errol Spence in the first 6 rounds. While I feel Kell Brook was winning, I had him 4-2 up. Errol Spence was doing some extremely interesting things with the lead hand. He almost took Brook's jab away in certain rounds where Brook would have to lead with his right hand instead. But yeah, he was fiddling with Kell Brook's lead hand, and he was able to kind of shoot inside after that and really work Kell Brook over up close. I want to see something similar in this fight. Obviously, I want to see Errol Spence Jr. lead with that jab, which is a very good punch of his out of that southpaw stance. But I want to see him try and fiddle around with his lead hand, change levels with it, try to move the gloves of Yordenis Ugas, etc., and try to distract him to get inside. Obviously, once Errol is on the inside or at mid-range, then he needs to let go of his body shots and test the gas tank of Yordenis Ugas, especially that right hook, of course, being the southpaw. Especially considering when you look at Ugas, sometimes when he'll jab, he'll kind of lean in a little bit with the jab, and it gives up his left side of his body, which again lines up to Errol Spence Jr.'s right hook. So a few level changes from Errol Spence Jr. in this fight wouldn't go amiss. Try to slip that jab and counter with a right hook to the body. I think Errol Spence Jr. is a pretty good counter-puncher when he wants to be. Doesn't do it enough in my opinion, but I think that right hook to the body could be a key counter for Errol Spence Jr. in this fight. I'm imagining that the jab of Ugas will be a big part of his game. So not only does Errol have to work on somehow taking it away, but also countering it. And I think the right hook to the body could be a very key shot for Errol Spence. Maybe again try to draw the lead of Ugas, slip, then right hook counter to the body. I think that shot could prove very effective for Errol Spence Jr. And also same goes for the right hook to the head out of that southpaw stance. Especially in the clinch, by the way. I see Ugas as somewhat open to that shot in the clinch. And as we know, Errol is very strong in the clinch in general. So if Errol can somehow get his right hand free in the clinch, I think the right hand could be very effective. I think the right hook in general is going to be effective for Spence, whether it's to body or head. I think Ugas is susceptible to that shot. And yeah, Errol needs to do what he does. He's not a complicated fighter. I think he gets underrated in certain aspects of his game. Like I said, his lead hand is very educated. He's got great variety in his shots. He's got a pretty good work rate, decent power, great body puncher. He's one of those guys, he actually doesn't waste many punches. He's quite economical, but at the same time, he throws a fair few shots. So I think he's an underrated fighter. I think he's got the skill set to impose on Yordenis Ugas. I think he's got more things in his toolbox than Yordenis Ugas. And ultimately, it's up to him to show it. And, I want to see Errol Spence Jr. at his very best. That's what I want to see from Spence. But yeah, I am picking Errol Spence Jr. in this fight, and I believe he's going to win this fight convincingly. And honestly, I'm going to go against the grain a little bit, and I'm going to say Errol Spence Jr. by late stoppage. I've got a funny feeling he's going to stop Yordenis Ugas late on in this bout. I know most people are going with points who are picking Spence, and I see that. That is the sensible pick. But my gut just tells me Spence wins this fight by late stoppage. I think Ugas will be feeling those body shots after a few rounds, and he'll be more of a sitting duck. And actually, I believe that he'll get knocked out in the end by the right hook to the head. But the body work would have caused the setup, So yeah, I've got Spence winning this fight by late stoppage. Could go to points. And Ugas is going to be difficult at times, but I've got Spence winning this fight. What about you guys? How do you see this fight going? Beanie Guy Delboy. Peace.